Good evening. This is about U.S. threats on China. New threats, but there's never been a time that the Chinese Revolution hasn't been under incredible, nonstop threats from U.S. imperialism. And from the earliest days of Workers' World Party as a political tendency, we've been discussing the impact of the Chinese Revolution on the global class struggle. Our evaluation of China was that it was a profound revolutionary, the most profound revolutionary upheaval in history, and it impacted profoundly the class struggle in the U.S. At the end of World War II, the capitalist class in the United States seemed all-powerful. It was the only economy not totally devastated by World War II. And even the colonies of the British and the French and the Dutch throughout Asia were weakened. The defeat of Japanese and German imperialism, but especially of Japanese imperialism, meant that the U.S. finally had a totally open door to all of Asia. That's how they saw it. And U.S. and British and French previously had big concessions in China, had troops, had navies on the Chinese rivers. And so the capitalists here in the United States really expected that they could just pick up the pieces. And they were quite shocked in 1949 with the victory of the Red Army in China and the crumbling of the entire U.S.-backed nationalist army, an army that was really an army of the landlords and the feudal and most backward and corrupt elements. The defeat meant that all those businessmen and many thousands of missionaries and troops fled with the defeated army to the island of Taiwan. It was a new day, and as Mao Zedong declared, China stood up. It was an enormous victory, and this victory awakened a working-class movement worldwide, a movement against colonialism and Western domination that resonated throughout Asia and especially in Africa and inspired millions to seize the moment. And the rage and shock in the U.S. ruling circles at this unexpected setback of the richest prize, the largest country in the world, and suddenly a communist revolution. Wasn't sudden, it had been going on for decades, but they had really won. They had really overturned this corrupt, decadent old state. And it became a major question of the Cold War and the witch hunt in the U.S. Who lost China? That was how they put it. Who lost China? Like it was theirs. They could taste it. They could feel it. They wanted those super profits, those investments. The Korean War, a cost of 3 to 4 million lives, was in great part an effort to find a way back into China. But the Korean people fought so hard against U.S. imperialism that the U.S. failed to even seize all of Korea. They could only hold on to half. The Vietnam War was also an effort to turn back the revolutionary tide that was sweeping all of Asia. Now, Sam Marcy, a founder of Workers' World, wrote about the impact of the Chinese Revolution and that it would have an impact on the class struggle in the U.S. because the class struggle is a global struggle, and there's no one geographic area that's immune. This was a founding theory of Workers' World, and the document, The Global Class War, was in many ways about the significance of the Chinese Revolution. There were others on the left who just dismissed the Chinese Revolution and also the Korean communists as peasant movements, not so important. And it was viewed as not a working class movement because the working class was so tiny in China and in Korea and throughout Asia at that time. What was missed was that this largely peasant army was under the leadership of a revolutionary working class communist party who were determined to build socialism. Now, the U.S. capitalists as a class were so hostile to China. They were denied a seat in the United Nations. They were blocked all trade, all investment, all industry, even spare parts. There was total sanctions and blockade on the revolutionary government. And the Soviet Union was in ruin after World War II and barely able to feed its own population or to rebuild. So there were not able to be much help in terms of what China needed to rebuild. China did manage, though, under communist leadership, to reorganize itself on a new basis. There were massive literacy campaigns, mass health and immunization campaigns, campaigns as basic as a campaign titled Away with All Pests, which was for basic sanitation. The heroic efforts of China to begin industrialization on their own, they called the Great Leap Forward. There were efforts to collectivize millions of tiny little holdings into collectives and then later to concentrate into the big communes. And all of this generated enormous debate, political struggles in revolutionary movements worldwide, and of course, in China. There were debates also with the Soviet Union and within the communist movement on peaceful coexistence with imperialism. And China really had a revolutionary line on them. Mao Zedong initiated a movement against privilege and reformism and for more revolutionary egalitarian direction called the Great Cultural Revolution. It shook up the Communist Party in China internally, and it shook up the entire world movement. As in Workers' World Party, we supported the Cultural Revolution. But we also recognize that China was still overwhelmingly underdeveloped and a largely peasant economy. And this is what forced, in 1978, there was a new effort to reach an accommodation with Western capital and get the technology that they were just walled off from, and to break through that blockade. It involved a lot of subterfuge, yes, but a lot of concessions. It was initiated by the famous trip of President Nixon to China. And what it was a decision to open the economy to Western investment, but on a limited basis initially, with special economic zones. China had millions of peasants who wanted an urban life, and they flocked to these new centers. Now, by Western standards, the wages were unbelievably low. But for many millions of people, they considered it preferable to the backwardness of rural life. China set very important conditions, though, on these low-wage factories, on all of them, that plants that were set up in China, the ownership after a certain number of years, 10 years, 15, 20, depending on what was manufactured, would revert to China. And that the management, plants, and the skills to run the plants had to involve Chinese workers. And that China would own not only the plants, but the technology and the blueprints that ran the plant. Now, imperialism never made a deal with anyone else in the world. They would plump down their plants and then pick it up and take it somewhere else and leave the people just unemployed, skillless. This was a big concession. But Western capitalists were willing to accept these conditions because the low wages were so profitable for the capitalists. And as Marxists, we know, profit comes from unpaid labor. The less you pay workers, the higher the rate of profit. China called this a win-win situation. They said capitalism globally, they're going to get a big source of profits. And they did, in a system that runs on profit. China was gaining desperately needed technology. The capitalists were pretty open in their predictions, and they said it incessantly, that once they gained a foothold and the capitalist market became entrenched, they'd be able to overthrow this communist government. So that was their expectation in doing this. They suddenly opened the doors to literally millions of Chinese students to study for advanced degrees in science and engineering in the West. They accepted tens of thousands of Western advisors going to China. They sold minority shares, even in the state-owned enterprises, in order to get the resources to modernize their own industries. They closed lots of unproductive state industries, laid off millions of workers. It was very dislocating. There are a lot of criticisms of this policy and this time. They called this new compromise with allowing the capitalist market to flourish in a socialist country. The term used was market socialism. They said it's socialism with Chinese characteristics. And market socialism was described as a compromise in maintaining a planned economy while opening a market economy. And it was described in China as a primary or early stage of developing socialism in an underdeveloped country. Now, just to say, as Workers' World, we did not support this policy. We never praised it, as some did. We considered it a very dangerous compromise because imperialism is so strong. We felt it was a dangerous compromise because we supported the Chinese Revolution, and we were hoping they would not be caught unaware. But we also did not denounce the Chinese government and claim that they had restored capitalism or that party officials were a new capitalist class, as many disillusioned Maoists did worldwide. They kind of wrote off China at this time. Now, at this time, there was also a process underway in the Soviet Union with reforms under Gorbachev, opening to the West, loosening party controls of the state, called glasnost, the opening, and perestroika. We're very critical of this policy especially. And U.S. imperialism was able to overturn socialism and actually bring down what appeared to be a stronger, more developed socialist economy in the Soviet Union. This was 1989, and actually break up the Soviet Federation, 1990. Now, about this same time in 1989 in China, in Tiananmen Square, there was a movement supposedly for democracy that Western capital really got their teeth into. And it seemed that China, as in the Soviet Union, would lose control of the party and of the state. And that counter-revolutionary movement was pushed back in People's China, much to the outrage of the West, who imposed a new round of sanctions on China and new restrictions. But the Communist Party in China learned a very valuable lesson from this. They kept opening the economy to Western investment, but they maintained a political hold of the state. Now, it is still a very dangerous policy, and that's true to this day. It is a deal with the devil. And there are millions of investments in China. And since 1978, China's experimented with many ways of attracting foreign investment and with different forms of integration into the global capitalist market. They've made deals with all kinds of Western corporations while still maintaining the centralized control of the state apparatus. And there's many forms in China. It's not just one centralized economy. There are many forms of public and cooperative and social ownership, both on the national level, on the state, provinces, counties, townships, along with the private ownership of big capital coming in. There's a determination to use the investments, especially to strengthen the state-owned industries and to invest in infrastructure and gather modern skills, and to put a big emphasis into developing the underdeveloped, the undeveloped parts of the economy. There are UN studies which describe this as the most incredible accomplishment. They say 800 million people pulled out of poverty, full literacy and an advanced education, modern cities, high-speed rail, advanced technology. They say this has never happened. It's actually allowed the UN to claim that they've succeeded in lowering poverty where they haven't anywhere but in China, and it's not by any UN efforts, it's by China's own efforts. Now, this is all a long introduction to where we are today. And that is that China has now grown into the world's second largest economy. And this is being evaluated in all the corporate media, and it's reflecting debates in the U.S. ruling class and in the U.S. top military commands. 40 years of uninterrupted growth in China since that 1978 deal, and the country is on track to becoming the world's largest economy, and that's expected to happen within the next 5 years. It's pretty incredible. And while opening the country to foreign capital investment, there's still organized and centrally planned attention on raising the economic level of the whole population, especially, as I say, the rural and underdeveloped areas. Illiteracy went from 80% at the time of the Chinese Revolution to it's now totally eliminated. China produces more graduates in science and engineering than the US, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan combined. It's quite an accomplishment. And the billionaire deciders and the power brokers of US imperialism are really hostile to this. It's a dramatic improvement in people's lives, and they are furious. So that's the perspective that we got to know. What they're talking about nonstop now is how do they stop China? Stunning growth will continue despite all the efforts to stop it with, and that's what the trade war and the military encirclement are really all about. Can they stop China? The Washington Post just explained the trade war isn't about trade. The trade war is about the United States trying to contain China and counteract its rise. They're pretty honest, right? And that's really what Trump's trade war is all about right now, and what Obama and Trump's pivot to Asia of all their military equipment and surrounding is really all about. Now, China is determined to defend its national sovereignty, both economically and now militarily. They've imposed their own tariffs on U.S. products, and the confrontations are really accelerating with U.S. warships. You know, the U.S. has this thing they call freedom of navigation, where they're sailing all over the South China Sea. It's like sailing into the Gulf of Mexico right off New Orleans, where they actually are. I mean, that is what the South China Sea is. It's the Gulf of Mexico. So when you have aircraft carriers and warships and jet overflights, and more of these freedom of navigation exercises, there was one just this past week where two warships, the Chinese ship came within 45 yards. Now on the high seas, that's like really brushing shoulders with a U.S. destroyer. So this pivot to Asia is a military reorientation of the whole Pentagon war machine to focus on China. It's aircraft carriers, nuclear weapons, destroyers, nuclear submarines, what are called the THAAD missiles, which are thermal high altitude defense, missile batteries. So all of this is their effort to push back on China and to get some kind of concessions. The real thing that frustrates them, and this is kind of incredible, and just even in working on this article, I started reading more on it, but what frustrates the capitalist class far more than China's incredible growth is that now the top 12 Chinese companies on the Fortune 500 list are all state-owned. Now, that means they're out of the hands. They don't get the profit. The biggest corporations are state-owned. This includes massive oil and solar energy, telecommunications, engineering, construction companies, banks, the auto industries, and, which the U.S. says, this is an unfair advantage. They receive state support and subsidies. The four largest banks in the world today, it's not Chase or Bank of America. It's Chinese banks, the four largest banks. Chinese firms now fill an unprecedented 120 places in the Fortune 500 global list. So they're almost a quarter of the biggest corporations. They were 10 in the year 2000. And the U.S. trend is going the other way. And that is what also is making them so anxious. Now, anywhere, if you're actually reading it, though, the description that they have in the U.S. for the state-owned enterprises is that these are dying dinosaurs, that they just absorb the resources and they don't produce anything of economic value. That's how they were always described. China has approximately 150,000 state-owned enterprises, of which about 50,000, or a third, are owned by the central government, and the remainder by these local and township and county and other means of collective ownership. It's very interesting, the different forms of collective ownership that exist in China today. And these state-owned enterprises, both central and local, account for about 30 to 40% of the GDP. So it's not a small part of the economy. They benefit from preferential government policies aimed at developing bigger and stronger industries, and they enjoy favorable access. The other thing that's very interesting is that all of these state-owned enterprises, and this is another U.S. complaint about them, seem to be managed by senior members of the Chinese Communist Party, who report directly to the Chinese Communist Party, and not to Wall Street or the global economy, or the World Trade Organization, or any of those accountable groups that they're always demanding, must be replied to, the IMF, the World Bank. No, they report to the Chinese Communist Party. Now, also, China's almost even with the U.S. when it comes to the big, giant tech companies. 9 of the world's top 20 tech companies are Chinese. The other 11 are the U.S. So there's a lot of complaints about this lack of transparency, about this funding, about this preferential access, and so on. And that's the basis, that's the argument that's being used behind the trade war. In terms of the largest auto manufacturers, 7 are from China and only 2 from the U.S. now. So, there are big changes in the economy happening on this unfair advantage that these state-owned enterprises have. Now, when the U.S. says that these state-owned enterprises have an unfair advantage, let's step back and look, because this is sheer hypocrisy. I mean, the largest U.S. corporations are military contractors, right? And they get billions in federal subsidies. Their whole existence is a huge federal subsidy. And that, combined with agribusiness that lives on federal subsidies for the last 70 and 80 years. So this idea that for China to give subsidies to their industries is sheer hypocrisy. And yet it's raised again and again. And then don't forget the U.S. banks in 2008 that were bailed out for $16 trillion. Now, what happened in 2008? It's very different in China. China saved and further strengthened its state-owned enterprises, and they kind of let the private-owned and the foreign-owned corporations fend for themselves. So, especially in 2008, things began to go even more decisively in the other direction. Now, there are a lot of things in this trade war to curb China's technological rise, banning the sales of all kinds of computer chips because there's unfair trade, and try to how to control information and technology. I want to go into a little bit on technology. The Trump administration calls for tariffs of about $150 billion worth of Chinese imports, and China responded by about $50 billion in tariffs, particularly on things like soybeans. I can get soybeans in other places besides the Midwest here. I want to say something about both NGOs that are under new restrictions in China. because there are thousands of them, and they operate as a form of political leverage, a lot of them from Hong Kong as a base, but throughout China, and they're under new regulations, all Western-funded NGOs. Now there are hundreds of thousands of volunteer organizations in China today, and all kinds of associations, literally in the hundreds of thousands. But the ones that are facing now restrictions are those who have their staff and their funding and their connection to the West. And they, a lot of them aren't being allowed to re-register, aren't being allowed to operate anymore in China, and these are the rules of in the last 2 and 3 years. Now, there's one other area where China is way ahead of the U.S. and that we don't even hear about here. Sometimes there's always this assumption that everything is more modern here. Nope. The internet. The internet in China is actually much, much bigger than it is in the U.S. And that was because, and actually China allowed Chinese innovators, and they're privately owned, a lot of them, to compete in setting up privately owned but monitored internet companies. So today, Alibaba, Tencent, Weibo, ByteDance, TikTok, Baidu actually rival and are much larger than Amazon, Google, Facebook, YouTube. Tencent, for example, has 647 million active users. China's a bigger country. And it's the world's largest online community. Alibaba is the largest e-commerce platform in the world. Smartphone payments in China are years ahead. And there's a whole operation of cyberspace using creative short videos, podcasts, blogs, streaming TV that is way ahead of anything that we operate with here. Almost currency is hardly used in China. A lot is paid for instead just with your smartphone. WeChat. WeChat has 889 million users who socialize, play games, pay bills, buy tickets, all just with a mobile messengering app. So, and I want to say also something on the national laws on sexual harassment and workers' rights. Because, you know, this is a country that hasn't yet passed the Equal Rights Amendment, for sakes. Now, this is not to say that social gains in any country in the world for women and LGBTQ people aren't way behind what they should be. And especially considering that China comes from a status where women had no rights, no education, and no standing, were literally the property of men in old China. So the change is huge. But many of these changes are now being codified into national law. Rather than here in the U.S., it's piece by piece. You're fighting every individual corporation, and in every contract, it's its own struggle, and it's divided by different corporate bosses and by states and so on. In China, there is a new civil code to curb sexual harassment in the workplace, and it says every manager is responsible for any sexual harassment in the workplace. That's a huge, and that's countrywide, in a country with 1 billion people. Under this new civil code that was presented to the National People's Congress Standing Committee, the management and employers are responsible to take measures to prevent, to stop, and deal with complaints about sexual harassment. And victims can demand that perpetrators assume civil liability for committing sexual harassment in word or in action, or by exploiting someone's subservient position. There's new legislation in China in terms of labor rights that these things aren't gifts. Actually, the Chinese workers fought for it, given a whole revolutionary heritage. There are more strikes in China than anywhere in the world. And it's just that the government doesn't repress it, but the workers are actually knowing they have to organize and win these concessions. But now, with this new legislation, workers have a right to be paid in full and on time, on a formal employment contract, 40-hour work week, fixed overtime rates, social insurance, health care, unemployment, work injuries, paid maternity leave, severance pay in the event of contract termination, equal pay for equal work, and protection against workplace discrimination. Now, that's quite a piece of national legislation, isn't it? Workers have a right to form unions and enterprise union committees, and they have to be consulted by management before there are any changes in pay or conditions. And I think Deirdre has written so really wonderfully on this and given examples of where bosses have tried to violate it, and literally one boss trying to lay off a big percentage of workers at a steel plant, the workers killed him. They did. And the government said justified homicide. So these are the changes that are coming that we should just know, because you don't read, you don't hear about this here. I want to say one other thing, if I have time. All right. The Belt and Road Initiative. Now, this is a real threat to the U.S. position globally. It's called the New Silk Road also, but the Belt and Road is $1 trillion program for the planet, you could say. And it's to provide infrastructure loans and equipment and training in Africa, Asia, and Latin America for a network of trade routes, new rail lines, ports, highways, pipelines, communication facilities, energy centers that will link countries on the 4 continents. And it includes financing for urban planning, potable water, sanitation, and food development. China's calling it the plan of the century. It is 12 times the size of the U.S. Marshall Plan at the end of World War II that rebuilt Western Europe. So this is a big deal. And it's such a threat because, and the U.S. says right up that this will change the global infrastructure and it'll challenge the U.S., led world order. Because, and there's a reason, there's nothing in the U.S. economy that can match this. That's their problem. Because U.S. corporations, the largest ones, are military corporations. They sell weapons. That's what they got. And the only thing they can do is sell weapons, and a country is then in debt, and that equipment is very quickly obsolete. You can't eat those weapons. And it doesn't provide roads or dams or irrigation or anything that's needed. And that's all the U.S. really has to offer. So they can't match any of these development proposals. They are heating up back on those NGOs, quite an NGO campaign claiming that this infrastructure program from China will leave countries indebted, that it's a new kind of exploitation and whatnot. Countries all over the world, though, between no development and development, this is a very, very good deal. And they also look at what China now has and what they need. You could look at Pakistan, so indebted and has bought generations of U.S. weapons, and they don't yet have a dam. Floods just destroy whole parts of the country every year. The other thing that China is doing is that they're reining in a number of projects that Chinese capitalists, remember those capitalists, they want to have ways to get their money out of China, and they were involving themselves in a lot of schemes. And so the Chinese government is reining in some of those because some of those schemes really were bad deals. There was a Chinese company that said that they would build housing in the West Bank, Palestine. The Chinese government said, no, you can't do that. And this is also true with some of the development projects in Africa. There's some that are part of the Belt and Road program, and there's others that were part of individual Chinese capitalists. And we want to keep that in mind, too. There are Chinese capitalists. They're Chinese millionaires and billionaires. So these big debates are going to continue within the progressive and working class movement on the social character of China's experiment in market socialism. It's valuable to study, and we should study much more the impact of the global and internal capitalist market in China, and also learn about the forms of social planning of the economy and the culture that leads to. It holds a lot of lessons for developing countries. There's a lot of experiments going on of what doesn't work, what hasn't worked, what's led to too much emphasis on consumerism, and what has worked. We could study a lot and learn a lot about the social weight and legal status and inheritance rights of these new millionaires and even billionaires. That should be evaluated. How much leverage do they have, or might they be expropriated, bought out quickly? We don't know. We do know that the Chinese working class now numbers 623 million. So that's about maybe almost 3 times the size of the working class in the U.S., I think. I don't know, I should do that. But its social weight and its political consciousness is growing. There are, as I said, thousands of strikes, job actions, new things to consolidate gains and working conditions. And it is the capacity of the working class to organize all a future society that will be decisive. There's a lot we don't know about ownership of productive forces by the state, by Chinese, and by foreign capitalists. We don't know a lot about all these different forms of collective ownership of small industries. There's a lot of rapid transition going on. But one thing we do know, we know whose side we're on. And we know what the U.S. wants to destroy and what they want to pull apart, whether it's with trade or economic leverage or sanctions or the biggest death machine on the planet. So in the final analysis, we are for militant working class solidarity, which is essential to opposing U.S. imperialism and its giant war machine. We say U.S. hands off China, and we salute the Chinese Revolution. It shows there's a lot to study, a lot to learn, and also a lot we don't know. But just on the question about the Koch brothers, a lot of their money is in agribusiness. And so they're going to be hit hard in this trade war because that's what China has cut a big piece on. So, there are economic, powers in the U.S. that are going to be hit hard in this in a lot of different ways. And all kinds of groups that thought they might benefit haven't really thought it through all the way. China, in order to stabilize its currency, sold off lots of its U.S. Treasury bills. They have more than $1 trillion invested in T-bills. Treasury bills, U.S. Treasury bills, yeah. And so they sell some of those, and they have. I think it's at the lowest rate in about a year right now, and maybe going lower. That's going to hit the U.S. in another way. So in terms of interest rates and lots of other things. So in one way, China's a developing country and still very poor in a lot of ways. So they will be hurt by this. They will be. But they may have more ability because they still have a planned economy to ride it out. The U.S. has to maximize, corporations here profit, every quarter. Otherwise, it's like bankruptcy. It goes down. There's no stability. So it's actually harder for them to ride some of this out. And also, this is a country that is in serious decline and decay. That's just the truth of U.S. imperialism today. It is. I want to say something about the Belt and Road, which is a huge investment program, it has lots of contradictions, because China's making loans and development to countries around the world as they are now. Now, that might be military dictatorships, maybe right-wing governments. It may be governments where the people's movement is therefore fighting. Does that mean they should support their government because they're getting a loan from China? No. You got to continue the class struggle. And also, it is true, the point about it's not a time when China is thinking in terms of revolutionary solidarity with people's struggles around the world. They are in a struggle for survival. This effort of U.S. imperialism to surround China, to cut off its trade routes, to cut them from the water. The Straits of Malacca, 90% of everything that China is getting come through those straits, and one aircraft carrier could shut it down. And the U.S. threatens this all the time. So part of what China is trying to do is build lots of other access through Russia, through Mongolia, through Pakistan, India, all different routes, and have all different trading relations. So it is, they're fighting a way out. They're fighting for their own survival. It doesn't mean this is revolutionary solidarity, every country that they are giving investment money to. But if we take the long view, just as when we look at China today, if you build ports and roads and infrastructure and communication and new industries, you are vastly increasing the size of the working class. And that's what's going to get you. And that is where our confidence should be. So it's not that we're saying every deal that's signed is a great thing or is liberating for the people of that country. No, there'll be capitalists who are getting rich off that. But the working class will also grow as a global class.